Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into one of the most brutal and fast-moving chapters in human history. A world where the horizon itself feels unsafe, where entire kingdoms fall before they even understand what's happening, and where a force from the pay is moving faster than anyone can prepare for. We're diving into what life was really like during the rise of the Mongol hordes. Forget the idea of distant history that feels slow, predictable, or controlled. The truth, if you were living anywhere near their path, you wouldn't last long without knowing exactly how to survive. And even then, survival was never guaranteed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you actually enjoy this. And drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft ambient hum, and let's step onto a windswept plain far from the safety of any walls you trust. Imagine open grasslands stretching beyond the horizon, dust clouds rising in the distance, and the faint thunder of thousands of horses growing louder by the minute. No warning, no time to prepare, just movement, relentless, organized, and unstoppable. Congratulations, you've just found yourself on the edge of the Mongol Empire's expansion. The good news? You're still alive. The bad news? An entire war machine is already moving closer, faster than any messenger can outrun. Life here is uncertain in a completely different way. Cities hear rumors long before they see anything. Traders vanish from roads overnight, and somewhere beyond the hills, scouts are already watching, waiting for the signal that changes everything. All right, settle in for a moment. Imagine waking up, not to an alarm, but to the sound of wind moving endlessly across open land. There are no streets, no buildings, no familiar noise of people going about their day. Just grass stretching as far as you can see, the sky wide and empty, and air so cold it feels sharp when you breathe in. This is the steppe, and this is where the Mongols come from. Now, right away, there's something important to understand. If you grew up in a house, in a town, or really anywhere with walls and stability, you're already living a completely different life from them. The Mongols were not settled people. They didn't build cities or stay in one place for long. Their entire way of life was built around movement. Their homes were called jairs, which are round, tent-like structures made from wood and thick felt. They weren't permanent. They were designed to be taken apart quickly, packed on animals, and moved across the land. A family could wake up one day, decide to leave, and by the end of that same day, there would be no trace they were ever there. Compare that to your life. You have a fixed place. Your belongings stay where they are. You rely on stability. The Mongols relied on constant change, and that difference matters more than you think. The steppe itself is not kind. It looks calm from a distance, but it's actually one of the harshest environments you could live in. Winters are brutally cold, with freezing winds that cut through clothing. Summers can be dry and unforgiving. Food is not always guaranteed. Water sources can be far apart. Survival here isn't easy, and it's definitely not comfortable. So, the people who grow up in this environment don't become average. They become tough. Not in a dramatic way, just naturally, from a young age. Mongol children were already learning how to ride horses, herd animals, and handle the outdoors. There's no option to stay inside and avoid the weather. The environment doesn't allow that. You either adapt or you struggle. And most of the time, you wouldn't adapt fast enough. Another thing that makes the Mongols very different is how central animals were to their lives. Horses, especially, were everything. Not just transportation, but survival. A Mongol warrior didn't have just one horse. He had several. If one got tired, he switched to another. This meant they could travel long distances without slowing down. Now think about yourself for a second. If you had to ride a horse for hours, maybe even days across rough terrain, in the cold, with no real rest, how long would you last? Probably not very long. And that's not an insult. It's just the reality of how different these lifestyles are. Mobility was their greatest strength. While settled civilizations built walls and roads, the Mongols built nothing that tied them down. They could move fast, change direction quickly, and appear where they weren't expected. To people living in cities, this made them almost impossible to predict. And this is where the contrast really becomes clear. If you lived in a medieval town or city, your life was structured. You had routines. Markets opened at certain times. Food came from farms nearby. You relied on systems, trade, protection, community. There were walls to keep enemies out, and a sense of safety that came from being surrounded by others. The Mongols had none of that. No walls, no permanent farms, no fixed roads. Their safety came from their ability to move and their skill in surviving harsh conditions. While you might feel secure inside a city, they would see that same city as something slow, predictable, and easy to trap. It's almost like two completely different worlds existing at the same time. One world is stable, structured, and dependent on systems. The other is fast, flexible, and shaped by constant movement. And when those two worlds meet, things don't go well for the slower one. Another small detail, but an important one, is mindset. If you grow up in comfort, even moderate comfort, you get used to things working in a certain way. You expect food to be available. You expect shelter to protect you. You expect some level of control over your life. The Mongols didn't have those expectations. Their lives were uncertain by default. That uncertainty made them adaptable. If something went wrong, they adjusted quickly because they were used to things going wrong. You, on the other hand, would probably hesitate. You try to figure things out, maybe panic a little, and in a harsh environment, hesitation can be the difference between managing a situation and completely failing it. There's also the simple physical reality. Living on the steppe builds endurance. Long rides, constant movement, exposure to the elements. It all adds up. The Mongols weren't just skilled. They were conditioned by their environment in a way that most people weren't. So when you hear about the Mongols later on, how fast they moved, how effective they were, how difficult they were to stop, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It starts here, in this environment, with this lifestyle. It starts with a way of living that is completely different from yours. And that's really the main point of this chapter. Before you even think about battles or tactics or anything like that, you have to understand this. You're not dealing with people who live like you. You're not even close to being on equal footing. They are shaped by a land that demands strength, speed, and adaptability. You are shaped by comfort, routine, and stability. And when those two meet, it's not a fair fight. Not even a little bit. So as we keep going, just keep this in mind. The reason you wouldn't survive the Mongol hordes doesn't start on the battlefield. It starts here, on the steppe. Keep that quiet steppe in your mind for a second. The wind, the open land, the feeling that nothing is really stable. Now, instead of looking at a whole group of riders, we focus on one person. Not a king, not a conqueror yet, just a boy named Temujin. He isn't born into power. His early life is actually pretty normal for the steppe, which still means it's tough by your standards. There's movement, survival, and uncertainty, but at least there's structure. His father is a tribal leader, which gives his family some level of protection and status. That stability doesn't last long. His father is poisoned by a rival group, and everything falls apart almost instantly. There's no safety net, no system to catch them. The tribe abandons Temujin's family, leaving them alone on the steppe with very little to survive on. This is the kind of moment where most people don't make it. No food security, no protection, no allies. If you were dropped into that situation, it would feel overwhelming fast. There's no time to sit and think, no time to plan carefully. You either adapt quickly, or things go downhill. Temujin grows up in this reality. He faces hunger, cold, and constant danger. At times, he has to steal food, just to stay alive, which already tells you how desperate things get. This isn't some clean, heroic rise. It's survival at its most basic level. At one point, things get even worse. He's captured by another group and forced into slavery. That's usually where a story ends for most people, especially in that environment. Once you lose your freedom out there, it's incredibly hard to get it back. But Temujin escapes. Not easily, not in some dramatic perfect way, but he gets out, and that moment starts to show what makes him different from everyone else around him. As he grows older, he doesn't just survive day by day. He starts building something. At first, it's small, just a few allies, a few people who choose to follow him. These aren't massive armies yet, just loyal individuals who see him as someone worth trusting. What makes him stand out is how he treats those people. On the steppe, loyalty usually comes from family or tribe. You stick with your own group, and that's it. Temujin starts to break that pattern. He rewards loyalty and skill instead of just bloodlines. If someone proves themselves, they earn a place with him, no matter where they came from. That idea spreads, and it starts pulling in more followers from different tribes. This is where things begin to shift. Instead of small, divided groups constantly fighting each other, Temujin is slowly bringing people together, not through comfort or promises of an easy life, but through structure, discipline, and a clear sense of direction. And that's something a lot of leaders struggle with. It's easy to gather people. It's much harder to keep them united, especially in harsh conditions. People argue, they compete, they look out for themselves first. Temujin manages to control that. He creates order where there usually isn't much. He builds a system where everyone knows their role, and where disloyalty actually has consequences. It's strict, but it works. Over time, these small groups grow into something much larger. Tribe by tribe, alliance by alliance, he brings the steppe under his control. Some join him willingly. Others don't really have a choice. Eventually, Temujin becomes Genghis Khan, not just the leader of one tribe, but the leader of a united Mongol force. And this is where things start to get serious, because now it's no longer scattered groups of riders. It's one organized, disciplined system. Every unit has structure. Every soldier has a role. Orders are followed quickly, without confusion. This is what turns them into something far more dangerous than a typical army. They aren't just strong individuals. They are coordinated, fast, and extremely efficient. And a lot of that comes down to leadership. Genghis Khan doesn't just lead from a distance. He understands the environment, the people, and the kind of discipline needed to survive and win. He plans ahead. He adapts when things change. He rewards success and punishes failure in a way that keeps the entire system tight. There's very little chaos once his structure is in place. Now think about yourself again. If you were placed into that world, under that kind of leadership, it would be intense. The expectations are high, and there's not much room for hesitation or mistakes. That's part of what makes this so important to understand. The Mongol hordes didn't just appear out of nowhere as some unstoppable force. They were built, step by step, through hardship, discipline, and very effective leadership. Genghis Khan's vision wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about expansion, control, and pushing beyond the limits of the steppe. He turned a harsh upbringing into something much bigger. And by the time he's done uniting the tribes, you're no longer dealing with scattered nomads. You're dealing with a machine. A very fast, very disciplined, and very focused machine. And this is only the beginning of your problem. Now that the tribes are united, things change. Not slowly, but in a very clear, structured way. What used to be scattered groups of riders is now something much more organized. It's not chaos anymore. It's a system. Genghis Khan doesn't just gather people and send them out to fight. He builds the army like a machine, piece by piece. Every part has a role. Every person fits somewhere. And everything is designed to work together without confusion. One of the most important things he creates is the decimal system. It sounds simple, but it's incredibly effective. Groups are organized into units of 10, then 100, then 1,000, and even 10,000. Each level has a leader, and each leader is responsible for the people under them. This means orders move fast. There's no shouting across a battlefield, hoping someone listens. Commands travel down the chain clearly, and everyone already knows what they're supposed to do. There's structure in a place where you wouldn't expect it. Now compare that to what you'd probably be part of. If you were in a typical medieval army, chances are you're not highly trained. You might be a farmer, maybe a laborer, suddenly handed a weapon and told to stand in a line. You don't train every day. You don't move as one unit. You're just there. And that difference matters more than anything. Because the Mongol army is built on discipline. Not just basic obedience, but real, enforced discipline. If you break formation, if you disobey orders, if you act out of line, the consequences are severe. Sometimes it's not just you who gets punished, but your entire unit. That creates something powerful. Everyone depends on each other, and no one wants to be the reason others suffer. So they stay sharp. They stay focused. Loyalty works the same way. It's not based on family names or status. It's based on trust and performance. If you prove yourself, you move up. If you don't last long. This is what we call meritocracy, even if it doesn't feel like a friendly version of it. The best fighters, the smartest leaders, the most reliable people rise through the ranks, not because of where they were born, but because of what they can actually do. And that creates an army where skill is everywhere, not just at the top, but all the way through. Now here's where things get even worse for you. Every single Mongol soldier is also a rider, not just someone who can sit on a horse, but someone who has basically grown up on one. Riding isn't a skill they learn later in life. It's something they've been doing since they were children, and they don't just have one horse. They have several. If one gets tired, they switch. If one is injured, they keep moving. This allows them to travel huge distances without slowing down. Days of riding that would completely exhaust you are just normal for them. So while you're thinking about marching, resting, maybe setting up camp, they're already miles ahead, or behind you, or somewhere you didn't expect at all. That speed changes everything. It means they can choose when to fight. They can surround enemies, disappear, and come back again. You don't get to control the situation. They do. And when you combine that mobility with their organization, it becomes overwhelming. This isn't just a fast group of riders. It's a coordinated force that can move quickly and still follow orders perfectly. Now think about what happens in a battle. You're likely standing in a group of people who don't fully trust each other, who haven't trained together much, and who are probably nervous. There's noise, confusion, and a lot of waiting. On the other side, the Mongols are already in motion. They don't wait around. They don't stand still. They move in units, following commands, adjusting constantly. There's also something else you need to understand. There is no room for weakness in this system. If someone can't keep up, they fall behind. If someone hesitates too much, they become a problem. And problems don't last long in an army like this. It sounds harsh, but it creates consistency. Every soldier is expected to perform. Every unit is expected to function. There are no random gaps, no unpredictable behavior. And that's what makes it feel less like an army and more like a machine. Each part supports the others. Each movement has a purpose. And once it starts moving toward you, it doesn't just fall apart. Meanwhile, you're trying to figure things out in real time. Maybe you've never even been in a real battle before. Maybe the person next to you is just as unsure as you are. And that's the moment where things start to break. Because against something this organized, this fast, and this disciplined, being unprepared isn't just a disadvantage. It's the whole outcome. You're slower. You're less coordinated. You don't have the same level of control or understanding of what's happening around you. And they know it. They've built their entire system around taking advantage of exactly that. So before a single arrow is even fired, before the fight really begins, the difference is already clear. You're part of a group trying to survive. They are part of a system designed to win. And once that system is in motion, it's very hard to stop. Now imagine this. You're standing out in the open, maybe with a group of others, trying to stay calm. There's no clear enemy in front of you, no line of soldiers marching toward you. The land looks empty, just wind moving through the grass like always. For a moment, it almost feels like nothing is going to happen. Then the arrows start falling. You don't hear a warning horn or a charge. You just hear a sharp sound cutting through the air, and suddenly people around you are dropping. There's no time to react properly, no clear direction to run. And the worst part is, you still don't really see where it's coming from. This is because of one of the Mongols' most dangerous weapons, the composite bow. It's smaller than you might expect, but much more powerful than a simple wooden bow. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it stores a huge amount of energy, allowing arrows to travel far, fast, and with serious force. Even at a distance, it can punch through armor that you would normally trust to protect you. Now add the horse into this. Mongol warriors don't just stand still and shoot. They're riding at speed, controlling their horses with ease, and firing arrows at the same time. That alone is something most people couldn't do under pressure. But for them, it's normal, almost effortless. This creates a situation where the enemy isn't just far away, they're constantly moving. You can't line up against them properly because they don't stay in one place. They circle, they spread out, they close in and pull back, all while continuing to fire arrows with accuracy. So, instead of a single attack, it feels like pressure from everywhere. The arrows don't come in one wave. They keep coming, one after another from different angles, never really stopping. It's not just physical damage, it's mental pressure building up every second. You don't get a break to think clearly. And this is where things start to fall apart for most people. Because you're trying to react to something you can't fully see. You might catch a glimpse of riders in the distance, but they're already moving again. You try to face one direction, and arrows come from another. It feels like you're always one step behind. This is what we call hit and run tactics. The Mongols don't commit to a single, direct fight right away. They attack, then pull back before you can respond. They repeat this over and over, wearing you down without giving you a real chance to fight back. And if you try to chase them, it gets worse. Because they're faster than you. Their horses are trained for endurance, and they can switch mounts when needed. You might manage to follow for a short time, but you'll tire out quickly. Meanwhile, they're still in control, deciding when to engage and when to disappear. At some point, frustration sets in. You want to see your enemy clearly. You want a fair fight, something direct, something you understand. But that's not what this is. This is controlled chaos, designed to confuse you and break your focus. And then comes one of the most unsettling parts. There are moments where everything goes quiet again. The arrows stop for a second. The riders pull back just enough to disappear into the distance. And you're left standing there, unsure of what's next. That silence doesn't feel safe. It feels worse, because now you're waiting, knowing that at any moment it could start again. Your attention is stretched in every direction. Your mind starts to race, trying to predict where the next attack will come from. This is the psychological side of it. You're not just dealing with weapons. You're dealing with uncertainty, fear, and the constant feeling that you're being watched. The enemy controls not just the battlefield, but your state of mind. And over time, that pressure builds. Your reactions slow down. Your decisions become less clear. People around you start to panic, and that panic spreads quickly. Once that happens, coordination breaks down completely. Meanwhile, the Mongols are still moving, still shooting, still in control. And the truth is, you probably won't even see the person who hits you. There's no dramatic moment where you lock eyes with your attacker. No final stand where you understand exactly what's happening. It's quick, distant, and almost invisible. One moment you're standing there, trying to make sense of everything. The next, it's over. And that's what makes these weapons so difficult to defend against. It's not just their power or range. It's the way they're used, combined with speed, movement, and control. You're not fighting something you can face directly. You're dealing with something that stays just out of reach. And that's what makes it so effective. Now here's where things get even more unsettling. The Mongols didn't just rely on speed, weapons, or skill. They understood something deeper, something a lot of armies ignored. They understood fear, and more importantly, how to control it. Before they even arrived anywhere, people already knew about them. Stories would travel faster than the army itself, carried by traders, survivors, and refugees. These weren't calm, balanced reports either. They were filled with panic, exaggeration, and horror, describing entire cities being wiped out. And when you hear something like that over and over again, it starts to feel real. Even if you haven't seen them yourself, your mind begins to fill in the gaps. You imagine the worst, and then you imagine something even worse than that. This is exactly what the Mongols wanted. They didn't try to hide their brutality. In fact, they made sure it was known. When they destroyed a city, they often left just enough survivors to spread the story. Those survivors would carry the fear forward, telling others what happened in vivid, terrifying detail. So by the time the Mongols even got close to your city, something had already changed. People weren't calm anymore. There were rumors, arguments, panic. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to run, and some just froze, not knowing what to do. That kind of division is dangerous, because once fear starts spreading inside a population, it weakens everything. Leadership becomes unstable. Decisions take longer. Trust begins to break down. And all of this happens before a single Mongol soldier is even in sight. Now imagine you're in that situation. You hear the stories. Entire places gone. Armies defeated easily. No real defense working. You try to stay calm, but it's in the back of your mind constantly. Every distant sound feels suspicious. Every piece of news feels worse than the last. Sleep becomes harder. Focus becomes harder. And that's the point. Fear isn't just an emotion here. It's being used like a weapon, slowly wearing you down before anything physical even happens. By the time the Mongols arrive, you're not thinking clearly anymore. You're reacting, not planning. This is why so many cities surrendered without a fight. Not because they were weak, but because they were already mentally defeated. Leaders would look at the situation and think, if we resist, we're all dead. If we surrender, maybe some of us survive. And in that moment, surrender starts to feel like the safer option. That's a powerful position for the Mongols to be in. They don't have to fight every battle. Sometimes, the outcome is decided before they even show up. And even when a city chooses to resist, the fear doesn't go away. It stays there, affecting every decision. Soldiers hesitate. People panic faster. Mistakes happen more often. Meanwhile, the Mongols arrive calm, focused, and fully in control. There's no confusion on their side, no second guessing. They already expect the enemy to be afraid, and they plan around that. They know that panic will spread, that resistance will weaken, and that the longer the situation goes on, the worse it gets for you. So they keep the pressure on. Sometimes they surround a city and wait, letting the fear build. Sometimes they show just enough force to remind people of what's coming. Every move is designed not just to win physically, but to break the enemy mentally. And once that mental break happens, everything else becomes easier. Because a scared group of people doesn't act like a strong one. They don't coordinate well. They don't think long term. They focus on immediate survival, which often leads to worse outcomes. At this point, it doesn't even matter how strong your walls are, or how many people you have. If the fear has already taken over, those advantages don't mean much. You've already lost control of the situation. And that's the real danger here. You're not just facing an army that's fast and skilled. You're facing an army that has already shaped how you think before you even see them. They've influenced your decisions, your emotions, and your expectations. By the time they arrive, they're not stepping into a fair fight. They're stepping into a situation where you're already on edge, already uncertain, already afraid. And when that happens, the outcome is almost predictable. Because once your mind is working against you, it's very hard to recover. So as strange as it sounds, the battle doesn't really begin when the Mongols show up. It begins much earlier, in the stories you hear, in the fear that builds, and in the quiet moment where you start to realize you might not survive this. By then, whether you notice it or not, the fight is already over. At this point, you might be thinking there's still one option left. If the Mongols are fast and deadly in open land, then maybe the safest place is behind walls. A strong city, thick gates, high towers, supplies stored inside. It feels logical. It feels secure. Like if you can just get inside and wait it out, you might be okay. That idea doesn't last very long. The Mongols were not originally known for siege warfare, but they adapted quickly. Instead of avoiding cities, they learned how to break them. And they didn't do it alone. As they expanded, they captured engineers from other regions, especially from places with advanced technology like China. These engineers were forced to work for them, building weapons and planning attacks against the very kind of cities you're hiding in. So now, those walls you trusted start to matter less. They bring in siege equipment like catapults, capable of launching heavy projectiles over long distances. Stones crash into buildings, walls weaken over time, and there's no safe place to stand. Sometimes it's not just rocks. Fire can be launched over the walls, starting blazes inside the city where people thought they were protected. And there's nothing you can really do to stop it. You can't go out and fight them easily, because they're still faster and more organized. But staying inside doesn't feel safe either. Every day, something hits the city. Every night, there's tension, waiting for the next attack. Then comes the part that really breaks people down. The Mongols don't always rush to destroy a city immediately. Sometimes, they just surround it and wait. No one gets in. No one gets out. Supplies stop coming. Food becomes limited, then scarce, then almost gone. At first, people try to stay calm. Rations are controlled. Leaders try to keep order. But as days turn into weeks, things change. Hunger sets in, and it's not something you can ignore. It drains your energy, your focus, and your ability to think clearly. Water can become an issue too, depending on the city. Clean sources run low. Disease begins to spread. Conditions inside the walls slowly get worse, even without direct attacks. And all the while, the Mongols are still out there. They're not struggling the same way you are. They're used to moving, to surviving in harsh conditions. They can wait longer than you can. They know time is on their side. Inside the city, tension builds. People argue more. Fear turns into desperation. Some might suggest surrender. Others want to keep resisting, but there's no perfect choice anymore. Because both options feel bad. If you surrender, you don't know what will happen. If you keep resisting, you might starve before anything changes. Either way, you're losing control of the situation. And that's the key thing here. Cities were supposed to be safe. That was the whole point of walls, gates, and defenses. But against the Mongols, that sense of safety starts to fall apart. What once felt like protection now feels like a trap. You're stuck inside, watching your options slowly disappear. The attacks continue. The supplies shrink. The pressure builds. And there's no clear moment where things turn around. It just gets worse. By the time the walls finally break, or the gates are opened, or the decision to surrender is made, you're already exhausted. Not just physically, but mentally. You've been worn down over time, piece by piece. And that's what makes this kind of siege so effective. It's not just about breaking the city. It's about breaking the people inside it first. So even in the place that felt the safest, even behind thick walls and locked gates, the reality is the same. You're not protected. You're just waiting. At some point, the waiting ends. Whether you're in the open or behind walls, there comes a moment where the Mongols are no longer just a story. They're real. and you can feel it before you fully see it. It usually starts with something small, a faint line on the horizon, almost easy to miss. Then the dust begins to rise, slow at first, then thicker, spreading wider across the land. It doesn't look like much yet, but there's a weight to it, a quiet signal that something is moving toward you. The air feels different. Conversations get quieter. People start staring in the same direction, even if no one says anything out loud. There's this shared understanding that whatever is coming, it's not good. As the dust gets closer, shapes begin to form. Not clear at first, just movement inside the haze. Then you start to make out riders, dozens, then hundreds, then more than you can easily count. They don't rush forward wildly. They move with control, steady and deliberate. And strangely, it's quiet. No loud war cries, no chaotic charge, just the sound of hooves against the ground, rhythmic and constant. That silence makes it worse. It gives you time to think, and thinking leads to fear. Because now you know, this is them. At this point, your body reacts before your mind catches up. Your heart rate picks up, your breathing changes. You start looking around, trying to figure out what to do, where to go, who to follow. But there isn't a clear answer. Then everything shifts all at once. The formation spreads out, faster than you expect. Riders break off in different directions, circling, positioning, surrounding. And before you can fully process what's happening, the attack begins. Arrows fill the air. They come from multiple angles, fast and constant. There's no single direction to face, no obvious place to run. People start moving, some forward, some backward, some just trying to get out of the way. And that's when the chaos really starts. Commands get shouted, but they don't carry far. Different groups react differently. Some try to form a line, others panic and break away. There's no coordination, no unified response. You try to stay focused, but it's overwhelming. There's too much happening at once. Movement everywhere, noise building, people running into each other, falling, shouting. And through all of that, the Mongols stay controlled. They don't rush into the chaos. They keep their distance, continuing to move, continuing to fire. Every action has a purpose. While everything around you feels random and disorganized, they're following a plan. That contrast is what breaks things apart so quickly. Because once a few people panic, it spreads. Others see it, react to it, and suddenly the entire group starts to lose structure. What might have been a defensive line turns into a scattered crowd. And a scattered crowd is easy to overwhelm. The Mongols begin to close in, not all at once, but in controlled waves. They push where resistance is weakest. They avoid areas that still have some structure. They read the situation and adjust constantly. You're not just being attacked. You're being taken apart piece by piece. At some point, you realize there's no clear front line anymore. No safe direction. Everywhere you look, something is happening, and none of it feels under control. You might try to run. A lot of people do. But running doesn't solve the problem. The riders are faster. They see movement. They respond to it. What feels like an escape often just leads you further away from any kind of support. And even if you try to stand your ground, it's hard to do that when everything around you is collapsing. People fall. Others step back. Gaps form. The structure disappears completely. And once that happens, there's no real recovery. What started as a group becomes individuals, each trying to survive on their own. And against something this coordinated, that doesn't last long. The attack doesn't feel like one big moment. It feels like a series of smaller ones, each one pushing things further out of control. A sudden rush here, a wave of arrows there, movement from the sides, pressure from behind. It keeps building until there's nothing left to hold on to. And through it all, you never really get a clear look at the person attacking you. They're always moving, always just out of reach, part of something larger. That's what makes it so disorienting. You're not facing a single enemy. You're caught inside a system that's already in motion. By the time you understand what's happening, by the time you try to react in a meaningful way, it's already too late. The structure is gone. The coordination is gone. There's no organized resistance left. Just confusion, movement, and the slow realization that this was never going to go your way. And once it reaches that point, it doesn't turn around. When the fighting finally comes to an end, things don't suddenly return to anything that could be called normal. In many cases, that is when an entirely different phase begins. One that is quieter on the surface, but often even more absolute in its consequences. The intensity of battle is replaced by a structured aftermath, where control is reasserted quickly and without hesitation. In the Mongol system, there is rarely space left for uncertainty once resistance has been broken. The Mongols did not typically leave behind unresolved situations or loose ends in the way some other forces might have. Their approach to defeated regions was methodical. What happened next depended heavily on what had occurred during the confrontation itself. If a settlement had resisted strongly in prolonged conflict, the outcome was often far more severe. If surrender came early and without prolonged resistance, there might be a slightly more organized transition afterward. But even then, the situation rarely resembled anything stable or reassuring for the surviving population. In many conquered cities and settlements, the aftermath was devastating. Large portions of the population were killed, not as a result of uncontrolled chaos alone, but through deliberate decisions that varied depending on resistance and circumstance. This was not random destruction in every case. It followed patterns of enforcement and deterrence. The message was clear. Resistance carried a cost, and that cost could extend far beyond the battlefield itself. Enslavement also formed a significant part of what followed conquest. Those who survived were frequently taken from their homes and relocated across vast distances. Entire populations could be dispersed, broken apart from their communities, and moved into unfamiliar regions under Mongol control. Many were assigned to forced labor, military support roles, or administrative service depending on their abilities and the needs of the expanding empire. For those affected, life did not simply change. It was completely reorganized from the ground up. Families were often separated in the process, sometimes permanently. People who had lived their entire lives in one town or region could find themselves transported across continents with no possibility of return. Identity, community, and familiarity were stripped away and replaced with obligation and survival under a new authority. Even when survival itself was achieved, the emotional and social cost was immense and long-lasting. At the same time, destruction across many regions was widespread and systematic. Buildings were damaged or burned, infrastructure was dismantled, and resources were often seized or redistributed. This was not only about immediate conquest or battlefield victory. It was also about long-term control. By weakening the ability of a region to quickly recover or organize resistance again, the Mongols reduced the likelihood of future uprisings and made reintegration into their expanding empire more manageable from their perspective. However, the aftermath was not entirely uniform, and not everyone was treated in the same way. The Mongols were known for being extremely harsh, but also highly selective in a practical sense. Individuals with specialized skills were often spared. Engineers, artisans, scribes, administrators, and others with valuable technical or intellectual abilities were recognized as assets rather than liabilities. Their survival was not based on mercy in the emotional sense, but on usefulness within the broader system that the Mongols were constructing. These individuals were frequently taken into Mongol service and relocated as well, but under very different conditions compared to the general population. They were assigned roles that supported governance, infrastructure, communication, or military engineering. In this way, the Mongol expansion was not only destructive but also absorbent, pulling knowledge and expertise from conquered regions and integrating it into their empire. This created a striking contrast within the aftermath of conquest. On one side, there was large-scale destruction, loss of life, and the collapse of established communities. On the other side, there was careful identification and preservation of specific individuals whose skills could strengthen Mongol administration and military capability. The result was not purely chaotic violence, but a system that combined extreme force with calculated selection. And this is one of the most difficult aspects of understanding the Mongols historically. Their actions were not driven solely by uncontrolled aggression or emotional brutality. They operated with a level of strategic organization that influenced even the aftermath of battles. Decisions about life, death, relocation, and employment were often made according to patterns that prioritize control, efficiency, and long-term dominance. If you were an ordinary person living in that environment, your chances of being singled out for preservation were relatively low. Most people were not engineers, scribes, or specialists. The majority of populations consisted of farmers, laborers, and everyday residents of towns and cities. In that context, most individuals were not seen as essential to the functioning of the Mongol administrative system. That reality placed them in a far more vulnerable position during and after conquest. This is a harsh truth, but it reflects how the system operated in practice. The value of individuals was often measured in terms of utility, skill, and immediate benefit to the empire. Survival was not distributed evenly, and outcomes were shaped by a combination of circumstance, timing, location, and personal ability. Luck also played a significant role, often more than people tend to assume when looking back at historical events. Even in situations where individuals survived the initial violence of conquest, the long-term reality remained uncertain. Life under Mongol rule varied widely depending on the region, the local administration, and the role assigned to different populations. Some areas experienced relative stability after incorporation into the empire, with restored trade routes and enforced order. Other regions remained tightly controlled, heavily monitored, and shaped by the constant presence of military authority. But in the immediate aftermath of defeat, there was little room for comfort or reassurance. The system had already moved beyond the moment of battle. Decisions had been made, structures were being reorganized, and the region was being absorbed into a much larger framework of control. The familiar world that existed before the invasion was effectively gone, replaced by something unfamiliar and imposed from above. And that is what makes the fate of defeated populations so difficult to fully comprehend. It is not only the violence of conflict itself, but the permanence of what follows. The removal of stability, the restructuring of society, and the reassignment of human lives into roles defined by an external power all contribute to a sense of irreversible transformation. In that kind of system, most people are not remembered individually. Most do not become part of recorded history in any meaningful way. They do not receive recognition, distinction, or narrative importance. Instead, they become part of the background of a much larger process, one defined by expansion, control, and restructuring on a continental scale. And if you had been there, experiencing that transition firsthand, you would most likely have been part of that same silent majority, caught in a shift of history that moved forward regardless of individual outcome, and rarely paused to acknowledge the people it passed over. After everything falls apart, your first instinct is simple. Run. Get away from the danger. Put as much distance between you and the Mongols as possible. It feels natural, almost automatic, like the only real choice left. You might think that if you just keep moving long enough, you'll eventually find safety somewhere else. But that idea doesn't hold up for long. The Mongols were not just fast in battle. They were fast in how they moved across entire regions. Their mobility wasn't limited to combat. It was built into their entire way of life. They could cover huge distances quickly, often moving in ways that were hard for enemies to predict or follow. On top of that, they didn't rely on chance. They used scouts constantly, sending out small groups of riders to observe, track, and report back. These scouts were skilled at reading terrain, spotting movement, and understanding where fleeing groups might try to go next. So even if you think you've escaped the main force, you're often still being watched. There was also an early form of intelligence network that helped them stay informed about regions far beyond the battlefield. Information traveled through traders, captured people, and local knowledge that was absorbed into their system. This meant they often knew where populations were moving, even when those people believed they were acting in secret. So when people ran, they weren't disappearing. They were relocating within a space the Mongols already understood very well. Refugees became a common outcome of invasions, but safety was not guaranteed for them either. Large groups moving across open land were easy to spot, and once spotted, they were easy to follow. The Mongols didn't always need to chase immediately. They could observe, wait, and intercept when the conditions were in their favor. And this is where things start to feel even more hopeless. Because running doesn't just mean escaping. It means surviving in an environment where you no longer have structure, protection, or support. You're exposed, tired, and often unsure where to go next. Meanwhile, the Mongols are still operating with coordination. They can move quickly without losing organization. They can split into smaller groups, surround areas, or change direction based on new information. That flexibility makes it extremely difficult for anyone fleeing to stay ahead for long. Even terrain doesn't offer the kind of protection you might expect. Open plains, hills, and river crossings can slow you down, but they don't stop someone who is used to long-distance travel on horseback. What feels like a barrier to you is often just another path for them. And the most unsettling part is the psychological effect this has on people who are running. At first, there's urgency, then exhaustion, then uncertainty. Every sound behind you starts to feel suspicious. Every distant movement feels like it could be them. You begin to question whether you're actually ahead at all. That feeling doesn't go away easily, because even when you stop seeing Mongol riders directly, you don't feel safe. You assume they could appear at any time. That uncertainty becomes constant, and it affects every decision you make. Where to sleep, where to move, who to trust. It all becomes harder. And that's part of why escape is so difficult in practice. It's not just about physical distance. It's about mental pressure that doesn't really stop once it starts. In many cases, groups of refugees would try to move together for safety, but that also made them more visible. Larger groups are easier to track, easier to predict, and harder to hide. So even attempts at safety often made people more noticeable in the long run. Over time, this creates a situation where nowhere truly feels safe. Not cities, not open land, not even temporary camps. Everything feels temporary, unstable, and exposed. You're always moving, always unsure, always aware that something might be coming. And the Mongols don't need to be everywhere at once for this to work. They just need to be present often enough, in enough places, that people never fully relax. So even if you manage to run, even if you manage to get away from one attack, the problem doesn't really disappear. It follows in a different form. Through scouts, through movement, through information, and through fear. And eventually, you realize something important. Running doesn't create safety. It just delays the moment you have to face uncertainty again. By this point, you might still be holding on to one idea. Maybe you're thinking that while villages, cities, and scattered groups don't stand a chance, a real army would. A trained force. Soldiers with armor, discipline, and experience. Something that actually looks like it belongs on a battlefield. But that assumption doesn't hold for long. One of the clearest examples of Mongol power was the collapse of the Khwarezmian Empire. This was not a small or weak state. It had cities, fortifications, and a functioning military system. On paper, it should have been able to resist, or at least slow down an invasion. Instead, it fell apart under pressure much faster than expected. Part of the reason was communication and leadership failure, but another major factor was how the Mongols fought. They didn't meet enemies in the way most people expected. They didn't rely on direct, static battles where two sides simply pushed against each other. Instead, they used movement, coordination, and constant pressure to break larger forces down over time. In many regions, heavily armored soldiers, like knights or elite infantry, were considered the strongest fighting units. They wore thick armor, carried heavy weapons, and were trained for close combat. In a direct confrontation, they would normally have the advantage against lightly armed opponents. But the Mongols rarely allowed that kind of confrontation to happen on equal terms. Instead, they used speed and distance. Mounted archers could strike from far away, then retreat before heavy units could close the gap. They could circle around slower forces, attack from multiple directions, and avoid getting trapped in one place. This made traditional formations much less effective. And once those formations started to break, things would fall apart quickly, because most traditional armies depended on structure, lines, ranks, coordinated movement. When those structures stayed intact, they were strong. But when they were disrupted, even slightly, confusion could spread fast. And the Mongols were extremely good at creating that disruption. They didn't just fight harder, they fought differently. They would test enemy positions, withdraw, and then strike again where defenses were weaker. Over time, this constant pressure made even large, organized armies lose cohesion. It wasn't always a single decisive blow. It was a steady breakdown of control. And this is what made them so dangerous to train forces. If you were an individual soldier in one of these armies, you would likely be used to a certain rhythm of warfare. You hold position, you follow commands, you rely on the people next to you. There's structure in how things are supposed to happen. But that structure doesn't survive long when the battlefield keeps changing around you. You might advance in one direction, only to find there's nothing there. You might try to hold a line, only to see it slowly stretch and weaken as pressure builds from different sides. And while all of this is happening, the enemy is still moving freely, never fully committing in a way you can lock down. That difference in flexibility becomes a major advantage, because the Mongols are not locked into one method. They adapt in real time. If something doesn't work, they change it quickly. If an enemy resists strongly in one area, they shift focus somewhere else. There's very little wasted movement. Now compare that to a more traditional army structure, where changing strategy mid-battle is difficult. Orders take time to reach different units. Movement is slower. Coordination depends on stability. And stability is exactly what is being attacked. Over time, even strong armies begin to lose their ability to respond effectively. Not because they are completely weak, but because they are being forced into situations they are not designed for. And once that happens, numbers matter less than expected. A large army that cannot coordinate properly becomes less effective than a smaller force that can move and act efficiently. That is one of the key realities of Mongol warfare. So when entire empires fall, it doesn't always look like one dramatic final battle. Sometimes it looks like a series of losses, retreats, broken formations, and failed attempts to regain control. And by the time people realize how serious the situation is, it's often already too late to reorganize. This is why the defeat of major powers is so important in understanding the Mongols. It shows that this wasn't just about overwhelming small groups or unprepared civilians. Even established states with trained soldiers and leadership struggled to respond effectively. And that leads to a very uncomfortable conclusion. If organized armies, with training, structure, and resources, cannot reliably stop them, then what chance does a normal person really have? Because at that point, it's not just a question of strength or courage. It becomes a question of whether the system you rely on can even survive contact with them at all. At this point, it might seem like the Mongols are unbeatable because of their weapons or their strategy. But there's another factor that makes everything even worse for anyone facing them. It's not just the army itself, it's the environment they operate in, and how completely they are adapted to it. The regions they move through are not easy places to survive in. There are vast distances between settlements, unpredictable weather patterns, and harsh seasonal changes that can affect travel and supply lines. Winters can be brutally cold, with freezing winds and snow that slows everything down. Summers can be dry, with heat and dust making movement exhausting. For most people, these conditions alone are already a major challenge. Travel becomes slower, food becomes harder to carry, and every journey takes more effort than expected. If you are not prepared, even a short trip can feel draining. Then there is the issue of resources. Food is not always available in large, reliable quantities across these regions. Supply lines can be stretched thin, and storage becomes a serious concern. If you are moving through unfamiliar land, you cannot always depend on finding what you need along the way. Water sources can also be unpredictable depending on location and season. Rivers might be far apart, wells might be scarce, and in some areas, conditions can make it difficult to sustain large groups for long periods. That creates constant pressure on anyone trying to survive or move through the area. On top of that, there's exhaustion. Long-distance travel is not just physically tiring, it builds up over time. Days of movement without proper rest begin to affect decision-making, reaction speed, and overall endurance. The longer you are exposed to these conditions, the harder it becomes to function normally. And then there is disease. In environments where people are constantly moving, where hygiene is limited and resources are stretched, illness can spread more easily. When you're already weakened by cold, hunger, or exhaustion, even small illnesses can become serious problems. Now compare this to the Mongols. They're not struggling in the same way. Their entire way of life is built around these exact conditions. They are used to cold weather, long travel distances, and limited resources. What feels extreme to others feels normal to them. Their mobility gives them a major advantage here as well. They can move quickly across long distances without needing the same level of supply infrastructure that other armies rely on. They are not dependent on slow-moving supply chains in the same way, which allows them to operate in places where other forces begin to break down. Even their endurance is different. Growing up in this environment conditions them from an early age to ride for long periods, adapt to changing weather, and function with fewer comforts. So, while others are struggling to keep going, they are still able to maintain movement and coordination. This creates a very uneven situation. The environment itself becomes part of the challenge. It slows down one side while barely affecting the other. It drains resources from one group while the other continues to operate effectively. For you, this matters more than you might think, because even if you're not directly in battle, you are still affected by everything around it. If you're trying to flee, travel, or survive in these conditions, the same environmental pressures apply to you as they do to anyone else who is unprepared. And that is where the problem becomes even more serious. You're not just dealing with an enemy force. You're also dealing with the land itself, which does not make survival easy. The Mongols, on the other hand, do not fight against the environment. They use it. They move with it, adapt to it, and in many ways, benefit from it. Cold weather does not stop them. Distance does not slow them in the same way. Limited resources do not affect them as severely because their systems are built around flexibility and movement. So while you are struggling with fatigue, hunger, and difficult terrain, they're continuing forward with relatively fewer obstacles. That difference adds up quickly over time, and eventually, it creates a situation where survival is not just about avoiding the enemy. It is about trying to survive in conditions where everything is working against you at once. Because in this kind of environment, strength alone is not enough. If you are not adapted, you are already at a disadvantage before anything even begins. At this point, the conflict is no longer just about winning battles or defeating armies in the field. It becomes something much larger, where entire regions are affected at once, and the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. The Mongol approach often involved applying pressure to whole populations rather than focusing only on soldiers. This meant that civilians, cities, and the systems that supported them could all become part of the wider outcome of war. For someone living through it, there is no clear separation between front line and safe place anymore. One of the key aspects of this strategy is the targeting of entire population centers when resistance is strong. This does not mean random chaos, but rather a calculated approach designed to end opposition quickly and prevent future resistance. Cities that resisted often faced harsher consequences than those that surrendered early, which created a strong incentive for submission. Over time, this pattern influenced how regions reacted even before direct conflict began. The idea of resistance itself became risky because the potential cost was already widely understood. Infrastructure plays a major role in how societies function, and it also becomes deeply affected during large-scale invasions. Roads, bridges, supply routes, irrigation systems, and storage facilities are all essential for maintaining stability in any region. When these systems are damaged or destroyed, the effects are not immediate collapse alone, but a slow breakdown of daily life. Trade becomes harder, food distribution becomes unreliable, and communication between regions weakens. Even if a settlement survives physically, its ability to function normally can be severely reduced. This creates a situation where recovery is not simple or quick. After the initial invasion passes, the region does not instantly return to normal conditions. Instead, there's often a long period where rebuilding is necessary and resources are limited. People may return to damaged homes, broken systems, and disrupted economies. In many cases, survival after the invasion still involves years of instability and hardship. The immediate danger may be gone, but the consequences remain present in everyday life. Another important element of this system is control over what happens after conquest. The Mongols were not only focused on destruction, but also on organizing and managing the territories they controlled. In many regions, they implemented systems of administration that allowed them to collect taxes, maintain order, and integrate local populations into their broader empire. This meant that after initial conflict, some areas entered a new phase of structured rule rather than complete abandonment. However, this transition still came with significant changes for the people living there. Local governance often changed under Mongol rule, with officials or overseers placed in key positions to manage regions. These roles were designed to ensure compliance and maintain stability across large territories. While some local systems were preserved in modified forms, they now operated under a wider imperial structure. For ordinary people, this meant adapting to new expectations, new rules, and new forms of authority. Even when daily life became more stable after conquest, it was no longer the same system that existed before. There is also an economic dimension to this strategy that affects long-term recovery. Regions that were integrated into the Mongol Empire often became part of larger trade networks that stretched across vast distances. This created opportunities for commerce and movement of goods, but it also meant that local economies were now tied into a much larger system. While this could bring stability in some cases, it also meant that local autonomy was reduced. Economic life became more connected, but also more controlled. For individuals living through these changes, survival takes on a different meaning. It is no longer just about avoiding immediate danger, but about adapting to a completely new structure of life. Even if physical survival is achieved, The long-term experience can involve uncertainty about identity, stability, and future security. People may find themselves living in regions that look familiar, but operate under entirely different rules. That sense of change can be just as impactful as the conflict itself. Psychologically, this type of prolonged pressure has a lasting effect on populations. Even after direct violence ends, the memory of what happened remains. Communities may become more cautious, more hesitant to resist, and more focused on avoiding future conflict. This is not just fear in the moment, but a long-term shift in behavior caused by experience. Over time, entire regions can develop a different approach to survival based on what they have lived through. It is also important to understand that from the Mongol perspective, this system was designed for efficiency and control over very large areas. Managing a vast empire required methods that could reduce repeated resistance and maintain stability across different cultures and regions. While the methods used were often harsh by modern standards, they were also structured in a way that prioritized long-term control. This combination of force and administration is what allowed such a large empire to function across continents. In the end, what makes this strategy significant is not only the immediate impact of invasion, but the long shadow it casts afterward. Even when fighting stops, the effects continue through economic change, social restructuring, and psychological impact on the population. Life does not simply return to how it was before. Instead, it shifts into something new, shaped by what has already happened. And for many people, even survival means living in a world that has been permanently altered. After seeing what the Mongols could do in battle, after understanding how they move, how they adapt, and how they break armies apart, you might think there is still one option left. Resistance. Fighting back. Refusing to submit no matter what. In theory, it sounds strong, even noble. But in practice, it rarely worked the way people hoped it would. One of the main reasons rebellion failed so often was simple. The Mongols responded to resistance with overwhelming force. When a region or city chose to fight instead of surrender, the consequences were usually severe and immediate. This was not a drawn-out negotiation or a slow back-and-forth conflict. It was a decisive response meant to end the possibility of future defiance quickly. Because of this, many rebellions never even had the chance to grow. Small uprisings were often dealt with before they could spread or gain momentum. Leaders who tried to organize resistance were targeted early, and without leadership, most resistance efforts fell apart quickly. What looked like a brave stand from the inside often looked like a short, failed attempt from the outside. Another important factor was how fear shaped decision-making. By this point in the Mongol expansion, many regions already knew what had happened elsewhere. Stories of destroyed cities and broken armies had spread widely, and even if some details were exaggerated over time, the overall impression remained consistent. Resistance was dangerous, and survival often depended on avoiding unnecessary risk. That knowledge changes how people behave. When you believe that fighting back could lead to total destruction, your choices become more limited. It is no longer just a question of pride or defense. It becomes a question of whether resistance is worth the potential outcome. And for many communities, that answer was often no. This is where obedience begins to form, not just through direct control, but through expectation. If people believe that resistance will lead to worse outcomes than submission, they are more likely to comply, even without constant enforcement. Over time, this creates a kind of psychological pressure that reduces the need for direct force in every situation. However, this does not mean that fear was the only factor. There were also practical realities that made rebellion extremely difficult. The Mongols maintained mobility, intelligence networks, and rapid response capabilities. This meant that even if a rebellion started in one place, it could be identified and addressed quickly before it spread too far. The ability to move fast across large distances made it hard for resistance movements to hide or organize effectively. In addition, internal division often played a role. Not everyone in a region always agreed on whether to resist or surrender. Some groups might see resistance as necessary, while others viewed it as too risky. This lack of unity weakened many efforts before they even fully began. When a population is split in its response, coordination becomes difficult, and the effectiveness of any rebellion drops significantly. There's also the issue of resources. Sustained resistance requires food, supplies, weapons, and organization. After an invasion, or even during the threat of one, those resources are often already strained. Without stable supply lines or external support, maintaining a long-term rebellion becomes increasingly difficult. Over time, exhaustion and scarcity work against the people trying to resist. In many cases, this combination of fear, logistical pressure, and rapid response created a situation where resistance was not just risky, but often self-destructive. A failed rebellion could leave a region in a worse condition than if it had surrendered earlier. That reality weighed heavily on decision-makers at the time, especially those responsible for the survival of entire populations. From a Mongol perspective, this dynamic reinforced their broader strategy. If resistance consistently led to worse outcomes than submission, then fewer regions would choose to resist in the future. This reduced the need for prolonged conflict in some cases, because the reputation of what happened after rebellion became part of the decision-making process itself. Over time, this created what can be described as an illusion of resistance. On the surface, people still had the choice to fight back. Armies could be formed, defenses could be prepared, and leaders could call for defiance. But the practical outcomes of those choices were often already understood in advance. The perception of choice remained, but the consequences shaped how that choice was actually made. For someone living inside this system, the situation becomes mentally exhausting. You are constantly weighing survival against resistance, safety against pride, and short-term loss against long-term uncertainty. And in many cases, the safer option is the one that avoids confrontation entirely, even if it comes at the cost of autonomy or control. So while resistance did happen, and while there were moments of defiance, it was often short-lived. Not because people lacked courage, but because the structure they were facing made sustained opposition extremely difficult to maintain. And that is what makes this chapter important. It shows that resistance is not just about willingness. It is also about conditions, timing, resources, and expectations. And under Mongol expansion, those factors were often stacked against anyone trying to fight back. In the end, the idea of resistance remained, but the reality of it was far more limited than it first appeared. After the fighting ends and the dust finally settles, life does not go back to what it was before. For the people who survive, the world they wake up in feels familiar in shape, but completely different in how it functions. The buildings might still be standing, the land might still look the same, but everything about daily life has changed in ways that are impossible to ignore. The first thing most people notice is that there is a new system of control in place. Authority no longer comes from the same local leaders or traditional structures that existed before. Instead, power is now part of a larger Mongol administrative system that stretches across many regions. This means that decisions are no longer purely local, and rules are shaped by a much wider empire. Taxes become a central part of life under Mongol rule. These are not optional or symbolic. They are structured, collected regularly, and enforced consistently. For many people, this becomes one of the most immediate and constant changes. What you produce, what you trade, and what you own can now be subject to external demand. It is not just about surviving day to day anymore, but also about meeting obligations set by a distant authority. At the same time, there are shifts in how society is organized. Some local systems are kept in place, but they often operate under supervision. Leaders may remain in name, but they are expected to follow broader rules and report into a larger hierarchy. This creates a layered system of control where local identity still exists, but it is no longer fully independent. For many people, this brings a strange mix of stability and pressure. On one hand, large-scale conflict may decrease after conquest because the region is now under centralized control. Roads may be safer than during wartime, and large-scale battles are no longer happening in the same way. In that sense, there can be a kind of order that emerges after the chaos. But that stability comes with a cost. Is stability under absolute power? Every aspect of life is now influenced by a system that is larger than any individual community. Decisions about movement, trade, and governance are no longer fully in local hands. Even if day-to-day life becomes more predictable, it is also more restricted. There are rules to follow, expectations to meet, and consequences for not complying. Cultural change is another part of this reality. When different regions are brought under a single empire, ideas, traditions, and practices begin to mix. Some cultures continue, some adapt, and some gradually change under new influences. This does not happen instantly, but over time, the identity of a place can shift in subtle but noticeable ways. For someone living through this, it can feel like a slow transformation rather than a single dramatic event. You're still living in the same place, but the systems around you are no longer the same. The way people speak about authority, the way trade works, and the way security is maintained all feel different from before. Daily survival still matters, but it is now shaped by new conditions. You still need food, shelter, and safety, but you also need to navigate the structure that has been placed over your life. That means understanding rules, paying what is required, and adapting to a system that is not entirely under your control. Some people may find that life becomes more stable in certain ways compared to the chaos of invasion. Large-scale violence may decrease, and trade routes may open across wider regions. But even in those cases, the feeling of freedom is reduced. Stability does not automatically mean independence, and that is one of the most important distinctions in this chapter. Because survival is not the same thing as freedom. You can continue living. You can adapt. You can find a way to function within the system. But your choices are now shaped by forces far beyond your local environment. The boundaries of what you can do are defined externally, not internally. So a day in the life under Mongol rule is not defined by constant warfare or chaos. Instead, it is defined by adjustment. Waking up, working, paying obligations, following rules, and navigating a world that is stable on the surface but controlled underneath. And over time, that becomes the new normal. Not peace in the way most people imagine it, but order maintained through power, structure, and control. After everything, there's still one question left. If you were actually there, in that time, in that world, is there any version of events where you make it through alive? Not as a hero, not as someone powerful, just as an ordinary person trying to survive. The answer is complicated, and honestly, not very comforting. There are a few situations where survival was more likely, but they were rare and often depended on factors outside your control. One of the most important was having a useful skill. The Mongol system, as harsh as it could be, still valued certain types of knowledge and labor. People like engineers, craftsmen, scribes, translators, and others with specialized abilities were sometimes spared because they could be used within the wider empire. But even this was not a guarantee. Being useful increased your chances, but it did not remove risk entirely. You still had to be in the right place at the right time, and even then, decisions about who was kept and who was not could change depending on circumstances. Survival in this case was conditional, not secure. Another situation where survival was more likely was surrendering early. Regions or cities that chose to submit without resistance often avoided the worst outcomes of conflict. This did not mean life remained unchanged, but it did reduce the intensity of destruction that could follow prolonged resistance. Early submission could sometimes lead to a more structured transition into Mongol control. However, even this choice was not simple. Surrender meant giving up independence and accepting new authority over your life. It was a decision made under pressure, often without full knowledge of what would happen next. People were forced to choose between uncertain resistance and uncertain submission, with neither option feeling truly safe. Location also played a major role in survival. If you lived far from major invasion routes or strategic targets, your chances of avoiding direct conflict were higher. Some regions experienced less disruption simply because they were not immediate priorities. Distance could act as a form of protection, at least temporarily. But even then, safety was not permanent. Expansion of an empire changes over time, and areas that were once distant could eventually become involved. So living far away did not mean complete immunity. It only meant delay. And that brings us to an important point. Even in the best-case scenarios, survival was never fully guaranteed. It was always uncertain. Circumstances could change quickly, and decisions made far away could still affect your life without warning. If you were a normal person during this time, your chances depended on a combination of luck, timing, usefulness, and geography. None of those factors were fully under your control. That alone makes survival something unstable rather than predictable. Even if you managed to avoid direct violence, your life would still change significantly. New systems, new rules, and new expectations would shape your daily experience. So survival does not necessarily mean continuing life as it was before. It means adapting to whatever comes after. And that is the uncomfortable reality of this question. There is no simple version of you would survive or you would not survive. Instead, there are small windows of possibility, shaped by circumstances that are constantly shifting. Some people made it through. Many did not. Most had very little control over which group they ended up in. So if you place yourself in that world, the honest conclusion is this: survival is possible, but fragile. It depends on factors you cannot fully predict or influence. And even in the best outcomes, life does not return to normal. Because in a system like this, survival is not just about staying alive. It is about what kind of world you are left living in afterward. After going through everything, it's easy to step back and see the full picture. The speed, the organization, the weapons, the psychology, the sieges, and the way entire regions were reshaped all connect into one system. Nothing about it works in isolation. Each part supports the others, and together they create something far more effective than most people expect at first glance. When you break it down, it's not just one advantage that makes the Mongols so effective. It's the combination of many smaller advantages working at the same time. Mobility across vast distances, disciplined organization, adaptable leadership, and a deep understanding of fear and timing all come together in a way that is difficult to match. Even powerful states and trained armies struggled to deal with this level of coordination. But this is not really about individual strength or personal failure. It's important to understand that clearly. The idea that you wouldn't survive is not about being weak or incapable. It's about being placed in a world where the systems around you are completely different from what you're used to. It's about circumstance, environment, and history aligning in a way that leaves very little room for the average person to influence outcomes. If you imagine yourself in that world, you are not starting on equal ground. You are not part of the system that created these conditions. You are not trained from childhood in the same environment, nor are you operating with the same tools, knowledge, or expectations. That difference alone changes everything about how survival works. The Mongols, in many ways, represent one of the most effective military and political forces in history. Not because they relied on a single overwhelming tactic, but because they combined many strategies into one flexible and highly responsive system. They could move quickly, strike unpredictably, adapt to different enemies, and maintain control over vast territories. That level of effectiveness is rare, even in long stretches of history. And when you view it in that context, the outcome becomes easier to understand. It's not that resistance is impossible or that survival never happened. It did. People survived. People adapted. Entire regions continued under new conditions. But the overall system they were facing made survival far more difficult than it would appear from a distance. As you think back through each stage, the movement across open land, the sudden appearance on the horizon, the psychological pressure, the sieges, the aftermath, and the long-term control, you start to see a pattern. It's not just violence. It's structure. It's consistency. It's the ability to apply pressure in multiple ways until resistance becomes harder and harder to maintain. And that is what makes it so difficult to imagine yourself in that environment and confidently say you would do better. Not because you lack ability, but because the conditions themselves are overwhelming by design. They are shaped by environment, adaptation, and experience that most people simply do not have access to. In the end, the title of this story is not really about a single person failing to survive. It's about understanding how fragile survival can be when everything around you is structured against stability. It's about recognizing how quickly normal life can be changed by forces far beyond individual control. So when you strip everything back, the final reflection is simple. It was never just about you. It was about the world you were placed in, the systems you depended on, and the fact that in that moment of history, those systems were not designed to protect you from what was coming. And as that thought settles in, there's a kind of quiet understanding that follows. Not dramatic, not loud, just still. Because once you understand the scale of it all, it becomes clear that survival was never guaranteed in the first place. And slowly, everything fades out.